Driving test. Two best friends, Kate and Gina, are driving one state over to go to a concert. It's some new boy band that these two are just in love with. It's about a 5-hour drive, so they both agree to take turns driving there. Around the 2-hour and 30-minute mark, they trade places at the steering wheel. They get to a toll booth and Gina drops a quarter in the slot and keeps on driving. They talk about how extremely excited they are as one of the boy band's albums plays on the radio. A vehicle behind them starts honking the horn and the girls become aware of this. Gina immediately starts to move over into the other lane. Maybe he was in a hurry, she said. The car sped past them and leaving them in the dust. Girls don't really want to pay this situation any attention and kept on talking and driving. They make a stop at a gas station, 30 minutes away now. As Gina pumps gas and Kate stays in the passenger seat, she notices the same car pull in to get gas. With the gas station lights on, she can now see the type of car it is. It was a black 1967 Chevy Impala. It had a 502 cubic inch big block V8, 18 feet of badass, Gina says. She was big on old-fashioned sports cars, but she doesn't approach it. She's kind of scared of it. A man all in leather gets out and goes inside the building, but the girls didn't see his face. Gina quickly gets back into the car and drives off as fast as they could. The remaining miles to the concert was in the middle of nowhere. The girls decided it would be easier instead of being in traffic if they had tried the interstate. 20 minutes away, the same car approaches, fast on their tail. Kate says, "Just pull over and let him pass you again," and Gina says, "No, I'll handle this jerk." The girls all of a sudden hear a man speaking from an intercom saying, "Good evening, ladies, and welcome to your driving test. Try and stay on the road as best as you can, and you might want to buckle up." Immediately the car hits them several times and try to knock them off the road. They both scream and Kate pulls out her phone to call the police. The car hits them again, knocking the phone out of her hands. The car hits them one more time and they hit the bridge. The car flips over and splashes into the lake below. The car stops, and the man gets out to watch the bubbles come up from underneath. Upon impact, their seatbelts locked up for their safety, and once they hit the water, there was no way to escape. Once the bubbles stopped, he gets into his car and drives off into town. He gets out at this arena, and a man who lets him out asks him, "What happened to your car, sir?" He said, "I hydroplaned on the way over here, but I'm okay." A voice announces him, and he comes out onto the stage. Apparently he was the lead singer in this boy band that Kate and Gina were going to see. He just kills people on the road in his scary car for a hobby. Several destroyed vehicles were found in the area, but he was never caught for his actions. The 1967 Chevy Impala roars down the street after the concert into the night. Trick or treat. Halloween night, a night of scaring people, and most of all, the candy. The entire state of Maine celebrates Halloween. Every house has some sort of decoration in their yard. From your average haunted house to your haunted porch. Every house on the street gave out candy, except for one on the end. A family lived there who all celebrated the holiday except for the dad. He hated Halloween and didn't want anything to do with it. He grew up in the Catholic Church and was told that Halloween was the devil's night. While the rest of his family go trick-or-treating, he stayed home. As he sits on the couch eating chips and watching the game, he gets a knock at the door. He opens it to find a little girl in a devil outfit, and she looks up at him and says as sweet as she could, "Twick or tweet." The man tells her to go away and that he doesn't have any candy. The little girl is sad, but turns around and walks away as she was told. The man sits back down on the couch and falls asleep. He gets another knock at the door, what seems like an hour or so later. The TV was on your traditional snow effect. How long have I been asleep for? When did the game end? Where is my family at? He checks his watch, and it was broken, stopped at 9:30. He goes to the hall and checks the time there, and that clock was also broken, stopped at 9:30. The knock gets louder and louder. He assumes that whoever is knocking would eventually get tired and move along, but never did. After hearing that annoying knock for almost 5 minutes, he answers it, and it's the same little girl in the devil outfit. Again, she looks up at him and says as sweet as she could, "Trick or treat." He looks at her and says, "Didn't I already tell you to go away and that I have no candy?" Again, the little girl says, "Trick or treat," and she holds out her bag. The man has had enough and says, "It's far too late for you to be out. Go home." He then goes to shut the door, and the little girl blocks it with her foot and says again, "Trick or treat." The man says, "You want something? I'll give you something." He reaches into the drawer beside the door and drops a Gideon Bible in her bag. He then says, "You need this more than you need the candy," and slams the door in the little girl's face. He then walks back into the living room and sits on the couch. He turns the TV off and leans back to take a nap. Again, the door begins to bang. Oogity boogity boo, even more louder this time. The man rushes to the door, ready to hurt a little girl's feelings, but when he opens it, there's nobody there but a note. He picks it up and opens it. It says, "Twick." All of a sudden, he hears a window break from another part of the house. The man locks the door and looks around the house to see where the noise came from. When he got to his bathroom, he saw that the window was broken into. He runs into the kitchen to call the police, and once he dials the last digit, the crucifix that's hanging over the dinner table turns upside down. He then hears little feet behind him, and when he turns around, he sees the girl in the devil costume. She slowly takes off her mask, revealing that she is the devil, the real devil in the flesh, sent up from the fiery pits of hell to walk the world this Halloween night, causing chaos for all mankind. The devil now speaks in its own voice, a really deep voice, saying, "Trick or treat." About 30 minutes later, his family come back from trick-or-treating with her 2 sons. She found it odd that the front door was locked, knowing that they would be back soon. She unlocks the door using the spare key from underneath the doormat. They walked into the kitchen and discovered his body, and written on the wall beside the upside-down crucifix in his blood says, "Trick or treat." The Last Laugh. A young man who goes by the name Fred Tucker deals with depression. He checked himself into Somerville Mental Hospital because he was afraid of causing self-harm. They take him to room 217, and he has a roommate who is balled up in the corner, crying. The 3 men dressed in white help him off the floor and strap him in the restraints on the bed. When they leave the room, he begins to talk to Fred, but he should have known that he wouldn't be getting a whole lot of shut-eye in a place like this. So he listened to what this man had to say. He was a comedian back in the 80s, doing stand-up at this comedy bar called The Comedy Store every night. He tried to move the crowd, but they just didn't get his sense of humor. Every other person that did their act was a hit, except his. He wondered why his act was so stale, so that night he gathered up some props to use the following night. The next night he had a full trunk of props, just like what Carrot Top uses today. He gets his name called and walks onto the stage. The audience already remember him from the night before and start to boo him. He begins his set, and again the jokes were lame and stale. At this point the audience has had enough and start to throw things like beer bottles and food. He's rushing to get his things to leave the stage, and a flying bottle hits him in the head. Now bleeding from the ear, he leaves the bar and goes home. Limping down the alleyway, getting into his apartment, he becomes angry. So angry that he's thinking of doing the impossible. That night, in his apartment, he gathers one final prop for his masterpiece performance. The next night, he was the last act of the night. He was going to let the audience enjoy their evening before he walks onto the stage. Before he walks in the bar, he locks the front door with a chain and a padlock. Sitting backstage, his time comes, and his name gets called. The entire crowd starts to boo him again, and he lets them. He gets on stage and stands in front of the microphone. He then says, "Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I sure hope you enjoyed the show. Since I'm the final act, it's my duty to make sure your night is worthwhile." He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a Colt Python. He begins to shoot the audience as quickly as he could, laughing while he does it. Once he finished off the entire crowd, he yells into the microphone, "Now I get the last laugh." The cops get in through the back and arrest him. The court sentenced him to life in Somerville Mental Hospital. As Fred sits nervously in the corner of his bed, the man coughs up a gym clip. He uses it to unlock his restraints and gets out of his bed. He pulls out a knife from underneath his mattress and kills Fred, as he laughs hysterically. They take him back to court for another murder charge. Instead of taking him back to the mental hospital and have him kill somebody else, they sentenced him to death at Shawshank State Prison. They cooked him in the chair on March the 6th, not before killing a few inmates who didn't get his jokes. Mr. Bear. A man who goes by the name Blaine Beck was an entertainer in the 90s. He did voices for popular cartoons and even dressed up in costumes on kid shows. One of his biggest and popular roles was as Mr. Bear on the show Mr. Bear's Fun House. He would sing and dance with the kids, and after the cameras turned off, he pulled his mask off and left the studio. After doing the show for a while, he was offered to go to a kid's birthday party as Mr. Bear. He showed up and surprised the kid, and he had a great day. In that same time period, another TV show was on the air, and it was a horrible show. A show with graphic images and someone in a Mr. Bear suit cutting its own eyes out. Word got around, and all the parents thought that Blaine was the one involved with that other show. They all tracked and kidnapped him. They took him in the middle of the woods, kicking and screaming, saying things like, "It wasn't me," or "You got the wrong person," pinning him to a tree and stripping all of his clothes off. They thought they would teach him a lesson. They tied him to the tree, poured gasoline all over it, and lit him on fire. As they watched him burn, the parents were chanting words such as sicko, pervert, and pedophile. Screaming in pain, he dies moments later. One of the parents was so disgusted, she threw up right where she stood. "You haven't smelled anything until you've smelled a burning body," says another parent, and they all laugh and walk home. On their way home, one of the parents was thinking, what if we had got the wrong person? But immediately ignored it. When all of them got back to their houses, their kids were missing. They were nowhere to be found. Even their babysitters were gone as well. They all filed a police report, but it really did no good. Years later, a man who was researching the bad TV show discovered the remains of all the kids who went missing those many years ago. The secret eventually got out, and all of the parents involved in the murder of Blaine Beck were charged to 15 years in Shawshank State Prison. The real people involved with that television show has yet to be found. A new sun. The loud screams of my kids still haunt me. I felt so stupid because I knew there was much more I could have done. I was asleep in my bed because I had worked that night at the hospital. It was the graveyard shift. I have to take dead bodies into the freezer, room to preserve them until their families come to claim them. It was a job nobody liked to do, and whenever it was time for someone to do it, we would play a little game of rock, paper, scissors, and this time I lost. I could hear the school bus stop in front of the house, and the pitter-patter sound of my kids running in the front yard. I ignored the loud sounds of the world and tried to get some sleep. I knew that tonight at work was going to be a huge pain in the ass. About an hour later, I heard what sounded like a bomb going off in the front yard, followed by one of my sons screaming and crying. I quickly ran outside to find my son's mutilated body on the ground and my other son crying. My son was hit by a car. The car wasn't there by the time I went out there. I guess it was a hit and run. I picked him up and we rushed to the emergency room. By the time we got there, he was already gone. As I sit in the waiting room, a broken pile of mess, an old man in a black suit walks into the room. He was really tall and had a mean look on his face. He walks up to me and hands me his business card, which only has an address, no phone number or company name. I asked him, "Who are you?" Then he turned around and left the room without saying a word. The next day I dropped my other kid off at school and drove to the address that was on the card. I don't know why I decided to drive there, because what if the old man is a psychopath or something? This is also not really a good time for me because I'm in the middle of planning my son's funeral. I drove for about 10 minutes till I got to the city. The place that I ended up at was an old building in a bad part of town. I was confused and nervous, but I walked inside the building anyway. The entire inside of the building was dark except for the one part of the room illuminating the old man sitting at his desk. I sit down in front of him and ask again, "Who are you and what do you want from me?" He looks up at he looks up at me and says, "I'm here to bring your son back." I then get ready. I then get really offended and grab my purse and start to head for the door. He stops me long enough to explain who he was and what he does for a living. He says that he runs a business making replicas of humans who had passed on. Each one of the robots come with a chip that makes them look, act, and sound just like the person you remember. For example, if you wanted to meet John F. Kennedy, he could make an exact replica of him. I thought the man was crazy, but I let him continue by saying, "Okay, make me a new son." Once he got all the information he needed, he stands up and says, "Okay, that will be $375, which for a single mother like myself is a lot of money. And what if this guy is just saying what I want to hear, so I'll pay him and get ripped off?" I ignored the little voice in my head and paid him. He tells me to come back tomorrow around noon to pick it up. I go home and wait for my other son to get dropped off by the school bus. The bus comes by and my son slowly gets off the bus. He doesn't talk to me. He just goes into his room and goes to sleep once he finishes his homework. The next day I take my son to school and drive to the building to pick up my son. I walk through the front door, and sitting in the middle of the room was a big wooden box. The old man was standing next to it, hammering in the last nails to keep the box closed. He says, "When you open the box, you will have some instructions to follow. If you read it correctly, it should work just fine." I say, "Thank you," loaded it into the van, and drove it home. I sat in the living room and opened the box, and to my surprise, it was my son. I started to cry and gave him, or it, a big hug. I read the directions, and it said to turn the switch on the back of his neck up. Once I did that, his eyes opened and head turned to me and said, "Mommy." I broke down again and gave him another hug. He said, "What's wrong, Mommy?" And I said, "Nothing. I'm just happy that you're here." We talked all day until my other son came home from school. I quickly told him to go upstairs for a minute. When he walks to the door, I tell him that God brought your brother back. I mean, what else was I going to tell him? That a creepy-ass old man made a robot version of him? He comes down the stairs and they hug for what seemed like an eternity. My son said, "I'm so happy you're back." And he said, "Back from where?" I interrupt the conversation and told them to go play and to not talk about it. As I stare out the window watching them play, I start to cry again. Then I get a phone call. It was the old man that built my son. He asks, "How is it?" And I say, "It's wonderful. Thank you very much." "You should see his brother. He's so happy." The man says, "That's good to hear. The reason I'm calling you is because his battery is dying." I ask, "What do you mean his battery is dying?" He then said that if I wanted to recharge his battery, that I would have to pay another $100. I didn't have another $100. I gave him every cent I had. The man says, "Well, that's too bad. His battery will die in about an hour." I hang up the phone in anger. I break down in tears on the floor. I quickly get it together and say to myself, I'm going to enjoy my last hour with him. What I forgot is that every bargain has a catch. I go outside and play tag with the both of my sons and enjoy every second of it. The Crossroads. Daniel Jarvis was a famous singer during the Depression, singing the blues down in Mississippi. He wasn't famous immediately until he made the deal that changed his life. He was playing at this bar in the middle of nowhere. He had his guitar, his microphone, and a few strangers who just happened to be there. As he smoked his red apple cigarette, he played a song he wrote himself. It was one of those songs that he wrote about his life. Of course, the blues were sad songs. Unfortunately, Daniel's life was never happy. He was one of those poor lads whose luck was terrible, and that's what got him to sing this type of music. He was looking for his big break, so that his luck may change, possibly for the better. As he thought on several occasions to kill himself, but he always gave his life one more try, and another, and another. The people in the bar thought he was a good singer, and a few came up and threw some pennies into his guitar case. After his song, he stood up from his chair and took a bow, and got 3 claps. He walked over to the bar and got a beer, paid for it with some of the change he received from the people. He drank about half of it and left the bar. He was heading to another bar across town tomorrow, so he was going to get a head start hitchhiking. While walking down the road, he gets stopped by a young man right in the middle of the crossroads. This man was really tall and thin and had a beautiful red suit on. His hair was slicked back and there was a big scar on his face. He then says, "Hello, son. I heard that you were looking for a big break." Daniel was nervous because he didn't recall ever telling anyone this except for himself. Daniel spoke up, "Yes, but how did you know that?" And the man said, "I'm a businessman. I know these things." He then says, "If you sign this contract right now, you'll have everything you've ever dreamed of. I'm talking money, cars, women, and most of all the fame." Daniel wasn't so sure about this, so he asked, "What's the catch?" And the man said, "No catch." Of course, Daniel wasn't aware that the man was lying, and he wouldn't find out until it was too late. He signs the contract very slowly, and once he finishes signing the signature, the paper disappeared before his very eyes. Deep inside, he was experiencing a little bit of regret, but tried really hard to ignore it. By the following year, his career went through the roof. He was making hit after hit, and he was untouchable. He was considered one of the most wealthiest singers at the time. He didn't see the tall and thin man until many years later, when he was on his deathbed in 1966. He was dying from cancer. Coming in and out of consciousness, he gets a knock at the hospital room door, and in walks the same tall and thin man. The man looked just the same as he saw him many years before. He came for his part of the bargain. The man speaks to Daniel and says, "I really hope you enjoyed the fame and fortune, because now it's time to go." Luckily for Daniel, he said the Lord's Prayer on his dying bed and asked for forgiveness. He was aware that he was making a deal with the devil those many years ago. He was just risking the fame and fortune. The man looks at him with an angry face and left the room. Daniel died moments later. We live in a world with good and evil, and it's all up to you. Guts. It was a cold night in the Wyoming home in the middle of nowhere. The outside air was as quiet as the day that the wedded couple moved in over 40 years ago. Barbara and Frank had just turned in for the night. It was so quiet in this home, you could hear a mouse fart 2 doors down, says Frank. They both had not been asleep for maybe an hour until they heard what sounded like a bomb go off outside. They both wake up to the sound, just completely horrified. Frank grabs his shotgun and they both slowly walk out the front door. In their cornfields lies a flying saucer, which had crash-landed there. The two of them didn't know what to do. Hell, they thought they were still dreaming. They walk into the cornfield, and when they go to the flying saucer, the door had been open and whatever was inside there is now walking around here somewhere. Barbara peeks into it with her flashlight, and inside was a big pile of human remains. She identified them as their neighbors. So that means these creatures could be walking around disguised as our neighbors. As soon as Frank said those words, their neighbors pop up behind them. They were saying things such as, "What are you doing out here at this time of night?" And, "We were just going for a walk because we heard a loud sound in the cornfield, and we were wondering what it was." They knew it wasn't them, but they continued to play along as if they were still alive, and there wasn't a big pile of guts behind them. They both played friendly for a little bit until Frank said he had to go to the bathroom. Frank always had a backup plan in situations such as this. He fought in Vietnam and always had a backup plan, just like MacGyver. As soon as he started to walk away, the humans turned, and their voices changed to a much deeper voice saying, "You ain't going anywhere." They began to chase Barbara and Frank back to the house. They managed to get inside the house and lock the door behind them, so that whatever those creatures were, they would not be able to come inside. They both went and hid in different parts of the house. Not long after they hid, the aliens busted down their front door. They can hear them. They can smell their flesh. Guts. It wasn't until the Epilogue. This journal entry was by the author of this book, Mark Douglas. who died a few years back due to an overdose on sleeping pills. These stories were his life and legacy, and we hope you enjoyed them. This was his last words before departing the world. October 29th, 1999. The cold sweat covers my whole body, and I wake up in a panic. I stumble over to the desk and write down what I had dreamt about, and I fill a glass of absinthe and slowly go back to sleep. I wake up around noon with a horrible hangover. I smoke 3 cigarettes and take 2 aspirins to ease the pain. I go to the desk and read over what I wrote the night before and work a story around it. A story with twists and characters, playing pretend on paper basically. I've been writing stories ever since I was little, and as I grew up, they got better and better. When I was younger, my parents didn't support my hobby. While my brothers and sisters were out doing things productive, I was alone in my room, lost in my own world. I didn't choose the writing lifestyle chose me, I guess. I'm finishing a book with over 20 years of work to publish. I'm almost done with the book, but I don't know if I can handle the nightmares anymore. I started writing at a young age, and that's when the nightmares begun. They were getting so bad that I stopped for a while. It wasn't until I met Bill Denbrough a few years ago, and that got me into writing again. He's an author as well, and a more successful one, writing such tales to make your blood run cold. I bought one of his books a while back. The Glowing it was called, and it was definitely an interesting story. I can't help but be a little jealous of him. But don't get me wrong, he's no William Shakespeare, but decent. I don't even think I'm as good as Bill. I've been working on my last story for the book, and I can't think of a good ending. All of my other spine-tingling tales have endings, but not this one. This will be my 5th published novel, and it will be my masterpiece. The first 4 didn't do well because they weren't scary. You see, that's what the fans want, to be scared. I've got plenty of tales, scary, disturbing, and sad, to make you not want to sleep for days. I sure wish I could sleep. I keep worrying about what my next horrible dream is going to be about. I don't know what's wrong with me lately. I'm on my 3rd glass of absinthe, and that's definitely abnormal. Am I depressed? Afraid? Maybe both. As a human, we always say we are okay, but in reality, we're more broken than ever. Everyone is broken in some way, and it's up to you to find out what that is. Some people find it and fix it, while others go on without ever finding it. I'm one of them who still didn't find what was broken, and I don't think I ever will. I'm really tired. I think I'll take some medicine and try and get some sleep. I'll work on this last story later. He laid down that afternoon and never woke back up. His body was discovered a few days later with over 20 years of stories laying on the bedside table. These stories became an instant hit and sold millions of copies. It's a shame he didn't live long enough to see his 15 minutes of fame. His life will live on through the pages of this book. The end.